The air in Harrow County, Georgia, in the year of our Lord 1883, was heavy with more than just a late summer humidity. It carried the weight of unspoken words, the burden of histories too painful to retell, and the strange, almost sacred quiet of one man, Elias Drew. For 18 years, ever since the earth itself had trembled under the thunder of cannons, during a war that promised freedom, yet delivered only a different kind of hardship, Elias had not spoken a single word. His silence was not caused by sickness, nor by a religious vow, but by a deliberate and deeply personal decision. It was a silence that had grown into legend, stirring both fear and curiosity. A blank space, onto which the people of Harrow County projected their own hidden worries and buried truths. What sort of man, they wondered, could carry such a weight, such a chosen emptiness, for so many years? What secrets could be powerful enough to close a man's mouth for nearly 20 years? And what event, what unimaginable moment could ever force him to finally break it? The answer, when it eventually arrived, would shake the very ground beneath their quiet and complicit world. Harrow County, Georgia, in the fall of 1883, was a place suspended between the spirits of its past and the uncertain outlines of its future. The war had ended almost 2 decades earlier, yet its wounds, both seen and unseen, ran deep through the red clay soil and the hearts of its people. The large columned homes of former plantation owners, like the wide Voss estate, stood as fading reminders of a lost time. Their paint was cracking, their wooden frames groaning under the strain of shrinking fortunes and stubborn pride. The fields, once crowded with the forced labor of hundreds, were now worked by a mix of sharecroppers and hired hands, black and white alike, tied to new agreements but often trapped by the same old debts. Poverty walked beside them daily, like a thin, hungry wolf, waiting patiently at the door, slowly gnawing away at whatever hope remained. In the middle of this quiet struggle and hidden tension moved Elias Drew, a man whose presence was as powerful as his lack of voice. Around 45 years of age, Elias had a body shaped by many years of hard labor beneath the unforgiving southern sun. His shoulders were wide, his hands rough and strong, able to repair a broken fence with care or guide a sick animal with steady patience. Yet it was not his physical strength that drew attention, but the deep stillness that surrounded him, a stillness so complete it seemed to swallow the sounds around him. His skin, dark like rich soil after rain, was marked by time and experience, but it was his eyes that held people's attention. They were deep-set, sharp, and always observing, missing nothing, yet revealing almost nothing. They held the quiet wisdom of an old oak tree, the patience of a river stone, and an understanding of human nature that felt both calm and unsettling. Elias lived in a small but carefully kept cabin on the edge of the Voss property, a place no bigger than a single room but filled with a sense of order and dignity that reflected the man himself. His daily life followed a steady rhythm of careful actions, each movement quiet, exact, and controlled. He woke before sunrise, when only the faintest light touched the eastern sky, and moved through his morning routine with the silent grace of a passing shadow. His breakfast was simple, usually cornmeal and whatever small provisions he could manage to gather, eaten slowly with the same focus he gave every task. Then, as the sun began climbing into the sky, he walked the well-known path toward the main house or the open fields, his worn leather boots making almost no sound on the dusty road. To the children of Harrow County, Elias was something between a legend and a mystery. They watched him from behind their mother's skirts, or from beside their father's legs, their eyes wide with both curiosity and nervous wonder. He ain't spoke a word since the war. They would hear the adults whisper, their voices low as if even mentioning it might call something strange into the air. Some children believed he had been cursed, while others thought he possessed a secret language that only animals could understand. A few of them would sometimes call out his name, hoping to hear a sound from him, but Elias would only give a small nod, almost too slight to notice, his eyes briefly acknowledging them before returning to his work. His silence, to them, felt like a riddle, something mysterious and slightly frightening that stirred endless imagination. For the older residents, especially those who remembered him from before the war. Elias's silence carried a far deeper meaning. Ruth, an elderly woman with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes filled with too many memories, often spoke of him with a soft sadness. He used to sing, she would say to anyone willing to listen, her voice thin and rough with age. Had a voice like a mockingbird, clear and bright, and he talked too. Oh, he talked about everything he read, about the stars above, about how the river moved and changed. Smartest boy I ever knew. Her words painted the picture of a very different Elias, a lively young man, full of voice and thought, making his present silence seem even heavier and more tragic. Ruth understood better than most that Elias's silence was not emptiness, but presence, a living monument to something that had been broken beyond repair. To men like Jedediah Finch, the foreman of the Voss plantation, Elias's silence created constant irritation and suspicion. Jedediah was a man who showed his cruelty through small daily his plays of authority, and he found Elias's quiet dignity deeply unsettling. He preferred his workers to be loud or at least openly obedient. Elias's calm stare and his refusal to join in complaints or casual talk felt like silent criticism. "He's always watching," Jedediah would mutter to anyone nearby, a nervous pulse beating at his temple. "Don't trust a man who won't talk. Makes a man wonder what he's hiding." Jedediah feared not Elias's strength, but the mystery behind his silence, the thoughts that must surely live behind those quiet eyes. He believed Elias saw too much and understood too much, and knowledge, left unspoken, could be dangerous. Elias's work on the Voss property changed from day to day. He was a capable laborer who could manage nearly any task given to him. He repaired fences, cleared brush from the fields, cared for the horses in the stable, and sometimes helped inside the main house when heavy work or repairs were needed. He moved through the large aging rooms of the Voss mansion with the same quiet skill he showed outside, his presence almost ghost-like. He was there, and yet not quite there, part of the household's workings, but strangely separate from it. When he needed to communicate something, he used simple gestures, a nod, a shake of his head, or when absolutely required, he wrote a few words on a scrap of paper in neat, steady handwriting. These notes were rare and brief, each word chosen carefully, never wasting even the smallest mark of the pencil. The year 1883 in rural Georgia was a period of deep social change. The hopeful promises of Reconstruction had mostly faded, replaced by the harsh truth of economic control and rising racial oppression. The black community, though legally free, found themselves trapped within a new system of debt, peonage, and strict Jim Crow laws that aimed to restore white dominance. Racial tension hummed quietly beneath everyday life, like a constant, unseen current. Elias, once enslaved himself, moved through this dangerous world, protected in a strange way by his silence. It made him both invisible and strangely noticeable at the same time. People often ignored him during conversations, yet his presence could always be felt. He stood as a living reminder of the past, a quiet witness to the present, and an unanswered question about the future. His very existence, silent yet firm, became its own quiet resistance in a world that demanded obedience. He was Elias Drew, the silent man of Harrow County, and his story, though still mostly unknown, had already become part of the land itself. To truly understand Elias Drew's deep silence, one had to go back further than the end of the war, further even than the day he chose never to speak again. One had to remember the boy he once had been, the son of Sarah, a woman whose spirit was as strong as the ancient cypress trees standing beside the riverbanks of the Voss land. Sarah had worked as a house servant, a woman of quiet strength and sharp intelligence, whose hands were skilled in cooking and healing, and whose mind carried countless stories, songs, and pieces of wisdom passed down through generations. She looked at the world, and at her son, with a kind of thoughtful awareness, as if she saw something bright inside him that could rise above their harsh reality. Elias, even as a young boy, possessed a mind eager for knowledge. He asked questions constantly, often surprising those around him with his curiosity. Sarah saw this hunger and risked much to help it grow. Late at night, after the big house had grown quiet by the dim light of a hidden candle or the faint glow of dying embers, she taught him. She used anything she could find: old newspapers, torn book pages, even labels from medicine bottles. She showed him letters, the sounds they made, and the wonder of joining them together into words and sentences and stories. Elias learned quickly, faster than she ever expected, and soon he was reading every scrap of text he could find. His mind opened wide to the possibilities that words carried. Along with reading came his love of writing. He filled small, rough notebooks with observations, thoughts, and simple poetry. These notebooks, made from gathered paper and stitched with thread, became his greatest treasures. Inside them, he wrote about birds flying overhead, the changing of seasons, quiet conversations he overheard, the wrongs he witnessed, and the dreams he dared to imagine. His writing became a secret garden where his thoughts could roam freely beyond the chains placed on his life. He wrote about the beauty of the world around him, the strength of his people, and his deep longing for a life beyond the plantation. These journals were more than simple records. They were proof of his spirit, a silent protest against the cruelty of slavery. The moment that shattered this lively young man and created the silent Elias Drew came during the troubled spring of 1865, when the final echoes of the war still rolled across the land. The Union Army had passed through the region months earlier, bringing with it a brief taste of freedom, only to pull back again, leaving behind a vacuum of authority and a wave of desperate, not often harsh retaliation from those who still clung to the old order. On the Voss plantation, the overseer at that time, a man named Pewitt, was known for his particular cruelty. His temper had grown worse as his world collapsed around him, and he believed the newly freed people were becoming too bold. Elias, then a young man of 27, had been found in the fields, not avoiding work, but taking a quiet moment to think while sketching a bird in his small journal. Pewitt rode past on his horse. His fact he read with whiskey and anger, and he noticed the little book. He snatched it from Elias's hands, his eyes narrowing as he realized the forbidden act of literacy. Slowly he flipped through the pages, his sneer growing with every line of Elias's neat writing and each careful drawing. The words, the thoughts, the very heart of Elias's inner life was suddenly open before a man who saw only defiance and danger to his authority. Pewitt did not beat Elias that day. The marks on the body would have healed with time. Instead, he chose a far more cruel form of punishment. He gathered Elias's full collection of notebooks, the years of notes, poems, quiet dreams, and observations, poems, quiet dreams, and observations, the very soul of the young man, and before Elias's shocked and silent eyes, he threw them into a roaring bonfire that had been lit to clear brush. The flames swallowed the pages, curling them into dark ash, and consuming Elias's words, his past, and even the dreams he had hoped to carry into the future. Pewitt stood watching Elias's face, waiting for tears, expecting pleas, expecting the young man to break down. But Elias, standing there, felt something shift deep inside him. It was not only pain or despair. It was a cold and powerful realization. His voice, his writing, and even his thoughts, when shared, had become a weapon others could turn against him, a weakness that could be taken and destroyed. In that moment, as the last glowing pieces of his written world faded into smoke, Elias made a decision. He would give them nothing. No sound, no word, no emotion that could be twisted, mocked, or used against him. He would become like a sealed fortress, his inner world locked away. His thoughts would remain his own, forever out of reach for men like Pewitt. His silence was not surrender. It was a quiet declaration of resistance, a refusal to take part in a system that tried to strip him of his humanity. It was a promise he made to himself. They would never again take his words from him because he would never again offer them. The price of this silence was heavy. It meant living in a world where communication was always difficult, where misunderstandings happened often, and where even the smallest request became a complicated set of gestures and signs. It meant facing the pity of some people, the suspicion of others, and the casual cruelty of those who saw his muteness as weakness or inferiority. It meant carrying the weight of every thought left unspoken, every joy never shared, and every sorrow locked away inside. His inner world, once alive with spoken words and written prose, slowly became like a vast silent ocean, deep and impossible for anyone else to truly understand. Yet his silence also became a strange form of survival. Without speaking, his other senses grew sharper. He began to notice the smallest changes in people's faces, the subtle language of their movements, the quiet tension that could fill a room without a single word being spoken. He listened closely to the tones in their voices, the pauses, the hesitations, and the lies hidden beneath smooth speech. Over time, he became like a living memory of the Voss property, a silent witness to its daisy patterns, its hidden struggles, and its slow decline. During those 18 years, Elias developed a complicated relationship with his own thoughts. He still thought in words, in long sentences and vivid stories, but they remained locked inside him. Sometimes he would trace letters in the dust with his finger, or silently mouth words when he was alone, a private connection with the language he had guarded so fiercely. He still carried a worn leather journal, though its pages were no longer filled with long passages of writing. Instead, they held strange symbols, detailed drawings, and sometimes, when the urge became too strong, a single carefully chosen word written in the same elegant hand he had always possessed. This journal became his private sanctuary, a place where the burden of silence could be quietly eased. His bond with Ruth grew stronger through the passing years. She was one of the few people who understood the deep pain that had led to his silence, though she never spoke of it directly. Much of their communication happened through small looks, a nod of understanding, or quiet acts that needed no explanation. Ruth would sometimes leave him small gifts, a piece of fruit, a shirt she had mended, simple gestures of care that recognized his strength and endurance. With Clara Hayes, the young mixed-race cook on the property, Elias formed a different connection. Clara had a gentle spirit and sharp, thoughtful eyes, and she never treated his silence as an obstacle. She would speak to him calmly, explaining what she needed, and waiting patiently for his signs or gestures. She looked beyond the silence and saw the thoughtful, kind man beneath it. Elias, in return, felt a quiet affection for Clara and a protective feeling toward her gentle nature in a harsh and unforgiving world. He often observed her while she worked, noticing her careful attention to her duties, her occasional worried looks, and the small changes in her behavior that suggested troubles she kept hidden. To him, she seemed like a kindred spirit, another quiet observer moving carefully through a world that often tried to diminish her. Inside the Voss household, Elias's silence was accepted in different ways by different people. Paulin Vos, the plantation owner, was a man filled with contradictions. He treated Elias with a distant but clear respect. He valued Elias's skill and dependability, and perhaps in some quiet way he recognized the deep dignity the man carried within him. He never forced Elias to speak and accepted his silence as a simple fact of life. Elena Voss, Harlan's sharp and thoughtful wife, was far more observant. She watched Elias with careful attention, sensing the depth of thought behind his quiet eyes and the sharpness of his awareness. She often wondered what memories and truths were hidden behind that silence, what stories he had witnessed during his years of watching and listening. She understood instinctively that Elias's silence was not emptiness, but a vessel filled with untold experiences. And it was these unspoken experiences, these long years of silent observation, that would soon be called upon to carry a terrible burden. The Voss property, despite its outward appearance of gentle aging and fading grace, was filled with quiet tensions and hidden dangers. Beneath the polite surface of Southern hospitality and the familiar rhythms of plantation life, a network of secrets had slowly been woven together, each thread tightening with every passing year. Elias, the silent watcher, stood in a rare position to see how that web had been built. His lack of voice made him merely invisible to those around him. At the center of this hidden network stood Jedediah Finch, the plantation foreman, Jedediah was a man deeply consumed by envy toward Harlan Voss, a bitterness that had grown over many years of feeling overlooked and unappreciated. In his mind, he was more capable and more deserving than the man whose shadow he always stood beneath. This envy, mixed with deep greed, slowly pushed him toward corruption. For years he had been quietly stealing money from the Voss estate, a slow, steady drain that weakened the already fragile finances of the plantation. His methods were simple but effective. Taking advantage of Harlan's distracted nature and Eleanor's focus on managing the household, Jedediah inflated invoices for supplies, secretly kept part of the crop profits, and altered the payroll records for the workers, sometimes creating workers who did not exist, or underpaying those who did. Hidden deep inside his cabin, he kept a secret ledger where he carefully recorded his stolen earnings, proof of his careful and patient greed. Elias, working across the plantation in the fields, the stables, and sometimes inside the main house, had noticed Jedediah's suspicious behavior. He saw the way the foreman lingered late at night over account books in Harlan's study. He observed the quiet, intense conversations Jedediah held with certain merchants in town. He noticed the sudden appearance of expensive new items in the man's cabin that did not match his known income. Elias's sharp eyes missed little, and these strange details were stored away in the silent archive of his memory. Clara Hayes, the young mixed-race cook, unknowingly became another thread in this growing web. Her responsibilities often placed her close to the household accounts. She handled food supplies, ordered provisions, and sometimes helped Eleanor with small bookkeeping tasks. During this work, she began to notice small irregularities. A sack of flour listed on the order but never delivered, sugar amounts that did not match the kitchen's usage, a bill for lumber that seemed far too large for the repairs that had actually been done. At first, Clara thought these were simple mistakes, something that could easily happen in the messy accounting of a large plantation. But as the irregularities continued, a pattern slowly began to appear. There was a quiet but steady loss of the household's resources. Clara, with her thoughtful mind, began connecting the details, her concern growing as she realized what the pattern might mean. Carefully and cautiously she began mentioning these concerns to Eleanor Voss. Eleanor, intelligent and observant, already carried her own doubts about Jedediah. She had long found his overly polite manner unsettling, and his sudden bursts of anger troubling. Clara's careful hints and soft questions about certain invoices or missing supplies strengthened Eleanor's suspicions. Their discussions were always indirect, moving carefully around the truth that neither of them yet spoke openly. Clara would quietly present a bill and gently point out a difference, her voice calm but questioning. Eleanor would study the document closely, her lips tightening slightly as she thought. Neither woman said Jedediah's name, yet the understanding hung heavily between them in the quiet room. Elias, often working close by, polishing the silverware or fixing a loose shutter, would quietly watch these exchanges. He noticed the small changes in their faces, the stiffness in their shoulders, and the way their voices dropped into low whispers. He saw the fear in Clara's eyes and the growing determination in Eleanor's. The relationship between Harlan and Clara was also unusual in its own way. Harlan, for all his faults, held a certain fatherly kind of fondness for Clara. She was hardworking, polite, and her cooking gave him real comfort and pleasure. He saw her as a useful, though still lower-ranked, member of his household. Clara, in return, treated Harlan with proper respect, but she also carried herself with a quiet pride that earned respect in return. She understood the silent rules of their world, yet she never allowed those rules to completely reduce her spirit. Elias, observing their interactions, could see the real though limited affection Harlan had for Clara and the careful way Clara moved through the difficult position she lived in. He also noticed Harlan's growing distance from the daily work of the plantation and his increasing dependence on Jedediah. That dependence slowly and quietly pushed him toward disaster. Elias's private journal, the worn leather notebook he carried everywhere, became the silent place where all these observations were stored. Its pages were not filled with sentences, but with careful drawings, strange symbols, and detailed maps of the land. It served as his personal archive of everything he witnessed. He sketched Jedediah's secretive movements, the exact location of a hidden ledger, the worried look on Clarara's face as she studied a bill, and the thoughtful crease in Elelenina's forehead. He drew the layout of the study, the position of the desk, and even the exact angle of the moonlight through the window on certain nights. Each drawing and symbol was a coded entry, a small piece of a puzzle that only Elias himself could fully understand. Long ago he had learned that the most dangerous truths were often the ones that could never be spoken aloud. Because of that, they had to be preserved in a language that only he could read. In the weeks leading up to October 17th, the tension around the Voss property became almost unbearable. It felt like something heavy pressing down on everyone, like the distant rumble of a storm slowly approaching. Jedediah grew more restless and angry, snapping at workers over small mistakes. His eyes moved nervously, as if he feared someone might uncover something hidden. Clarara also seemed different. She became quieter and more withdrawn. Her gentle manner was replaced by a silent worry that stayed in her eyes. She spent longer hours in the kitchen, her movements slower and less graceful, her gaze often drifting far away in thought. Elelena, on the other hand, became sharper and more alert. Her conversations with Clarara happened more often and always in quiet voices. She began studying the plantation accounts again with fresh determination, turning pages slowly and carefully. Her suspicions slowly hardened into a cold and terrible certainty. Elias moved silently through this tense atmosphere and felt the tightening of unseen threads. He saw the fear in Clara's eyes, the desperation in Jedediah's restless movements, and the deepening worry in Elena's face. From years of careful watching, he understood something important. Something terrible was getting close. The silence that had protected him for 18 years now felt heavy around him. Like a thick cloak, it muffled the cries he sensed would soon come and locked away the words he might soon need to speak. Still he continued to observe, to record, and to remember every small detail, every look, every gesture, every quiet truth that no one dared to speak. Somewhere deep inside, he felt that one day this silent testimony might matter. What he did not yet know was the terrible price that would come with it. The evening of October 17, 1883, arrived in Harrow County with a calm that almost felt deceptive. The air was still warm from the sun of the day and carried the faint sweet smell of drying hay, along with the distant singing of cicadas. A thin sliver of moon hung low in the sky, like a small clipping of fingernail, casting long soft shadows that moved gently with the breeze. Elias had spent most of his day repairing a broken section of fence near the far pasture. When dusk began coloring the western sky with shades of orange and deep purple, he returned to his small cabin. His daily routine brought him comfort. It was a steady anchor in a world that often felt uncertain. After eating a simple meal of stewed beans and cornbread, he usually sat on the small, shaky porch outside his cabin. His worn leather journal rested quietly on his knee. He did not always write in it. Many nights he simply observed. He watched as the stars slowly appeared, one after another across the dark sky. He listened, tended to the sounds of the countryside at night, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle rustle of leaves, and sometimes the faraway bark of a dog. During these quiet hours, his mind worked freely, without the burden of speech, slowly arranging the day's observations into the careful understanding he carried inside himself. But on this night, the peaceful feeling seemed slightly disturbed. A faint tension touched the air, like an invisible thread. Earlier in the day, Elias had seen Jedediah Finch arguing angrily with a field worker over a small mistake. Jedediah's face had been red with anger, and his movements restless and sharp. Later Elias noticed Clara Hayes hurrying from the main house toward the kitchen. Her shoulders were bent forward, and her head lowered, something unusual for her steady and confident walk. Elena Voss had also been seen pacing slowly along the veranda, her hands tightly clasped together, while her distant eyes seemed lost in troubling thoughts. Elias stored these details quietly in his mind, recognizing the subtle shifts in the human landscape around him. As night deepened, he remained on the porch, his eyes resting on the distant lights of the main house. One lamp burned steadily inside Harlan Voss's study, shining through the darkness like a small beacon. Harlan often stayed up late reading or studying his ledgers, so the light itself was not unusual, but tonight it seemed to flicker strangely. Soon Elias heard faint sounds carried by the night air. At first, the voices were soft and unclear. Then they grew stronger. They came from the direction of the study. Though the exact words could not be heard, the tone revealed rising anger and tension. Elias focused his gaze. Shadows moved behind the study window. One large shadow moved sharply, its gestures forceful and aggressive. Elias recognized the broad figure of Jedediah Finch. Another smaller shadow stood nearby. The shape was delicate and familiar. It was Clara Hayes. The voices grew louder. Jedediah's tone was sharp and furious, while another voice, softer and pleading, answered him. Elias felt certain it was Clara. Then suddenly, a loud sound rang out, like something falling hard against the floor or breaking apart. For a brief moment, everything went silent. Then a single cry pierced the air. It sounded desperate and frightened before being cut off suddenly. Elias slowly rose from the porch. Moving quietly, he approached the line of trees that bordered the main house. Hidden by the thick leaves, he had a clearer view of the stable yard. His breath slowed as he watched carefully. A figure burst through the back door of the house and hurried toward the stable. The person moved quickly with nervous urgency. It was Jedediah Finch. Jedediah rushed straight to the stable with his head lowered and shoulders tight. Elias saw him struggle briefly with the latch before disappearing inside. Moments later, the door creaked open again, and Jedediah stepped out leading a horse. It was the mare Bess, Harlan Voss's prized riding horse. Bess was easy to recognize with her dappled gray coat, the white blaze on her face, and 3 white socks on her legs. Elias knew the horse well, since he had cared for her many times. Jedediah saddled the mare with clumsy, hurried motions, nothing like the smooth movements of an experienced rider. Then he climbed onto her back with a desperate scramble. A sharp kick sent Bess racing forward. Within seconds, the horse and rider vanished into the dark road, leading away from the plantation toward the distant town. Elias carefully noted the time, the direction, and the strange urgency of Jedediah's departure. He remained hidden among the trees, while his mind tried to connect what he had seen. The angry argument in the study, the sudden cry, "Yea," and Jedediah's hurried escape on Bess formed a pattern that filled him with dread. The silence that followed was deep and heavy, broken only by the steady singing of the cicadas. When morning finally came, it did not bring peace. Instead, it revealed horror. The young stable boy Thomas made the discovery. He had gone to the kitchen early to collect water for the horses. The kitchen door stood partly open. Inside, he found Clara Hayes, lying motionless on the cold stone floor. Thomas let out a terrible scream. His voice shook with terror as it echoed through the quiet morning. The sound shattered the stillness of dawn and pulled everyone from their beds and cabins. Workers rushed from every direction. Harlan Voss stumbled into the kitchen with a pale face. Elenina followed closely behind him, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Jedediah Finch, who had returned before sunrise with his clothes wrinkled and his face drained of color, pushed through the crowd with wide eyes, pretending surprise. Within moments, the atmosphere changed from shock to fear, and then to something darker. An unspoken accusation began to move quietly through the gathered workers and household staff. Whispers spread quickly among them. Clara Hayes was dead. How? Why? Who? The questions hung thick in the air, still unanswered, yet already building a story in the minds of many people. Deputy Thomas Thorne, the local law officer, arrived soon after, his uniform sitting awkwardly on his shoulders, and his face already marked with the weight of a crime he clearly wished had never happened in his quiet county. He was a man with little imagination and even less courage. Known for choosing the easiest road, he looked over the scene, his eyes shifting nervously from Clara's still body to the faces of the gathered crowd. It was Jedediah Finch, someone finally said, stepping forward. Jedediah's voice was surprisingly calm, and his gaze did not waver. It was Josiah Miller, he declared, speaking with loud confidence. He was seen hanging around here last night. Always had a temper, that one, and he argued with Clararara just yesterday. I heard it myself. Jedediah's words, spoken with such certainty, quickly began shaping the story, pushing the blame away from himself and toward an easy target. Deputy Thorne, clearly relieved to have a suspect ready, nodded slowly. His eyes narrowed with suspicion toward the absent Josiah Miller. He did not question Jedediah's claim, did not ask for proof, and did not ask for proof, and did not consider other possibilities. Instead, he simply accepted the convenient story placed before him. Elias Drew stood at the edge of the crowd, his presence as quiet and still as a statue. His eyes, however, were alive with deep and painful understanding. He had seen Jedediah leave. He had heard the desperate cries. He knew with absolute certainty that Jedediah Finch was lying. And when Deputy Thorne's gaze swept across the faces of the onlookers and briefly met Elias's unblinking stare, Elias felt a cold warning settle in his chest. He understood that his long-kept silence, the shield he had carefully built over the years, was about to be tested in a way he had never imagined. The truth, he realized, would demand a voice, and that voice, against all odds, might have to be his own. The arrest of Josiah Miller happened quickly and harshly. A grim scene unfolded beneath the bright glare of the late morning sun. Deputy Thorne, encouraged by Jedediah's confident accusation and the unspoken demand to solve the shocking crime, quickly wasted no time. Josiah, a respected black preacher from the small community just outside the Voss property, was found at his simple cabin, preparing for his Sunday sermon. He was known as a calm and thoughtful man, admired for his powerful sermons and his strong faith, a pillar of support for his congregation. The accusation struck the community like thunder, cruel and deeply unfair. Thorne, joined by two quickly deputized white farmers, forced their way into Josiah's home. Their faces were serious, their hands already resting on their pistols. They gave no explanation and showed no warrant. They simply seized Josiah and roughly tied his hands behind his back. Josiah, shocked and confused, protested his innocence, his voice steady but firm. "I swear before God, I know nothing about this," he said, his eyes wide with disbelief, but his words were ignored. He was dragged from his home past his crying wife and frightened children and marched through the dusty roads of Harrow County. It became a display of injustice meant to spread fear and reinforce the old order. The white townspeople watched from their porches with a mixture of curiosity and quiet approval, while the black community looked on with deep sadness, their faces marked with a familiar helpless anger. The reaction across the community was swift and divided. For many white residents, Josiah's arrest confirmed what they already believed. It provided a simple explanation that required no deeper thinking. The murder of a young woman, especially one of mixed race, was tragic, but the quick arrest of a black suspect gave them a comforting feeling that order had been restored. For the black community, however, it felt like a familiar nightmare. They knew Josiah personally. They trusted his character and understood too well the cruel system of injustice that often targeted men like him. Quiet whispers of a fixed trial and a predetermined verdict spread through their homes like a cold wind. Among those who knew the truth, or at least strongly suspected it, was Samuel Davies, a white merchant from town. Samuel was a nervous and cautious man whose booziness depended on keeping good relations with the powerful figures of Harrow County, especially Harlan Voss, and, by extension, his foreman Jedediah. On the night of October 17th, Samuel had been returning home late from a business trip to a nearby county, his wagon filled with goods. On the lonely road, he saw Jedediah Finch riding Bess, racing wildly away from the Voss property. Jedediah's face looked desperate, his clothes messy and out of place. For a brief moment, their eyes met in shock as their paths crossed in the darkness. The image burned itself into Samuel's memory, standing in sharp contrast to Jedediah's calm appearance the next morning. But Samuel's fear proved stronger than his conscience. He feared Jedediah's anger, feared losing his livelihood, and feared being pulled into something dangerous. So he stayed silent, even as guilt gnawed at him day and night. Elelena Voss watched everything unfold with a growing feeling of dread and suspicion. She knew Jedediah better than most people, having observed his temper, his bitterness, and his hidden resentment for years. Clara Arras' quiet hints about missing money, combined with Jedediah's restless behavior in the days before the murder, and his quick accusation of Josiah, all came together in Elena's mind like pieces of a dark puzzle. She tried to speak with Harlan, sharing her concerns, and suggesting that Jedediah should be questioned more carefully. But Harlan, overwhelmed by grief, and perhaps unwilling to face the corruption within his own household, brushed aside her worries as simple nerves. He trusted Jedediah, or perhaps he only wanted to trust him, choosing the easy explanation that spared him further pain. His silence, in its own way, mirrored Elias's silence, but it was born from denial rather than careful observation. Deputy Thorne's investigation, if it could even be called an investigation, was careless and shallow. He spoke to a few field workers who, under Jedediah's watchful eye, repeated vague claims about Josiah's temper or supposed dislike of Clararara. None of it was real evidence. No weapon was found. No solid proof connected Josiah to the crime. Yet Thorne did not search very hard. The pressure to close the case quickly and calm the uneasy white community was simply too great. Jedediah, meanwhile, moved around the property with growing confidence. Each passing day made his smirk more visible. He believed he had successfully pushed suspicion away from himself, and he carried himself with the swagger of a man who thought he had escaped justice. Elias Drew watched everything with his usual quiet stillness, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the heartbreak in Josiah's wife's face, the nervous glances of Samuel Davies, and the silent worry in Eliana's expression. He saw Jedediah's smug satisfaction and Deputy Thorne's careless incompetence. Elias knew the truth, a truth slowly being buried beneath fear, lies, and convenience. He began visiting Josiah in his small, damp cell at the county jail. The visits were silent. Elias would sit on a rough wooden bench across from the bars, his gaze calm and steady. Josiah, who had at first been filled with despair, slowly found a strange comfort in Elias's presence. There was no need for long explanations. Elias's eyes alone showed belief and understanding. During one visit, Elias quietly slipped a small folded piece of paper through the bars. Josiah unfolded it carefully, his heart beating fast. Inside there were no words, only a carefully drawn sketch. It was a rough map of the Voss property, with one spot marked by a small X near the stable. Josiah looked up, meeting Elias's eyes, and in that silent moment a spark of hope lit within him. He understood. Elias was pointing to where the truth might be hid, and if only someone had the courage to look. Meanwhile, preparations for the trial moved forward at a frightening speed. The jury, as expected, was made up entirely of white men, many of whom had already decided what they believed. Josiah's defense lawyer, a young and inexperienced attorney from another town, seemed overwhelmed and intimidated by the powerful men around him and the strong prejudice in the courtroom. Jedediah remained close to the center of events, whispering to Deputy Thorne and speaking often with the prosecutor, his influence clear to anyone paying attention. Harlan Voss stayed strangely quiet through it all, his face showing deep conflict. He attended the early hearings, his eyes sometimes drifting toward Elias, as if searching for answers that were never spoken. His silence, once a sign of strength, now felt heavy, almost like quiet approval of the injustice unfolding before him. Elias, however, was not truly silent anymore. In his own quiet way, he was preparing. He continued to observe every detail, recording everything carefully. His journal, now filled with careful notes and observations, became a silent weapon, proof of what he had seen and understood. He knew that truth, once buried, never stays buried forever. It begins to rot beneath the surface, poisoning everything around it. And Elias knew with a growing certainty that the moment was coming when his long silence would finally have to break, not for his own sake, but for the innocent man whose life now hung dangerously in the balance. The courtroom waited, almost like a stage prepared for a tragedy. But Elias carried a story that no one had expected. The Harrow County courthouse on the morning the trial of Josiah Miller began felt like a suffocating furnace of tension and heavy heat. The air inside the small wood-paneled courtroom was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, smoke, and the nervous sweat of worried spectators. Every bench was crowded, a sea of faces mostly white, their expressions showing a mix of grim curiosity, self-righteous anger, and a few, like Ellen Voss, holding a quiet and desperate hope for justice. The windows, tall and narrow, offered very little relief from the late autumn sun that streamed inside, lighting up the dust motes, floating in the heavy air, and casting a harsh, unforgiving glow over the proceedings. Judge Amos Crane, a man whose heavy jowls sagged with the burden of many years, and whose eyes carried a tired cynicism, presided from his raised bench. In theory, he believed in the fair and impartial use of the law, but in practice he understood the complicated dance of power and prejudice that ruled his small part of Georgia. He struck his gavel, a sharp crack that briefly silenced the murmuring crowd, and the trial began. The prosecution, led by an ambitious young district attorney eager to build a reputation, presented a case built mostly on weak circumstantial evidence and attacks on character. They portrayed Josiah Miller as a man with a violent temper, someone prone to sudden anger, who had secretly carried resentment toward Clara Hayes. Witnesses, mostly white laborers from the Voss property or townspeople holding old grudges, were called forward to speak about Josiah's supposed bad nature or vague arguments they claimed to have overheard between him and Clara. Their testimonies often contradicted each other, filled with gossip and rumor, and were clearly influenced by Jedediah Finch, who sat at the prosecution table, his presence a constant and threatening shadow. Jedediah himself eventually took the stand. His voice was smooth and confident as he carefully built a story about Josiah's jealousy and rage, a tale he had clearly practiced many times. He claimed he had seen Josiah near the main house on the night of the murder, a clear lie that went unchallenged in the tense courtroom. Josiah's defense attorney, a nervous and inexperienced man named Mr. Abernathy, was plainly overwhelmed. He stumbled through his cross-examinations, his questions easily brushed aside by the prosecution's witnesses, and his objections were often dismissed by Judge Crane. He struggled to form a strong defense, his arguments drowned beneath the weight of public opinion and the quiet but powerful racism that filled the room. Josiah himself sat calmly at the defense table, his hands folded together, his face calm and dignified. Yet in his eyes there was deep sorrow, a quiet acceptance of the terrible fate he knew was being unfairly forced upon him. Every now and then he glanced toward Elias, who sat in the very last row, a silent and unmoving figure. His eyes remained fixed on the trial with an intensity that seemed to cut through the very air of the courtroom. The testimony everyone waited for came from Samuel Davies, the traveling merchant. Samuel, pale and shaking, was called to the stand. He swore on the Bible, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes nervously drifting toward Jedediah Finch, who watched him with a cold, predatory smile. The prosecutor pressed Samuel carefully, knowing he had been traveling that road on the night of the murder. Samuel stuttered, his words catching in his throat as he described his journey, the late hour, and the empty road. But when he was asked if he had seen anyone near the Voss property or anyone riding away from it, his eyes met Jedediah's. At that moment his courage collapsed. "No, sir," he muttered quietly. "Saw no one. The road was empty." The road was empty. A soft wave of disappointment moved through the black section of the gallery, while Jedediah's smile grew wider in silent victory. Samuel quickly stepped down from the stand, almost running, his face filled with shame and relief. Berry Elenana Voss, sitting in the front row of the gallery, became paler with every passing hour. She watched the line of false witnesses, the weak defense, the confident smirk of Jedediah, and the slow, painful march toward an obvious injustice. Her eyes often searched for Harlan, who sat beside her, his face tense and silent. His quietness was almost as deep as Elias's, though it came from a different burden. She saw the struggle in his eyes, the battle between his loyalty to Jedediah and his growing realization of the truth. But he remained silent, trapped by fear, indecision, and the shame that scandal might bring. The trial continued for 3 painful days. At last the prosecution rested its case, confident that victory was already theirs. Mr. Prosecution rested its case, confident that victory was already theirs. Abernathy gave a weak closing argument, his voice lacking strength, his words unable to move a jury whose minds were already decided. Judge Crane began preparing his instructions for the jury, his voice dull and steady, the final result seeming certain. Then, in that moment of crushing certainty, a small movement stirred in the back of the courtroom. Elias Drew, who had sat motionless for 3 days like a silent shadow, slowly and carefully rose to his feet. The movement was so unexpected, so completely unheard of, that every head in the room turned at once. A deeper hush fell over the courtroom, stronger than any gavel could command. People leaned forward, whispering softly, wondering what the silent man could possibly be doing. Judge Crane paused his instructions, surprised by the sudden disturbance, his eyes settling on Elias. "Mr. Drew," he said slowly, his voice filled with curiosity, "do you have business before this court?" Elias simply stood there, his tall body straight and still. His eyes, usually calm and guarded, now burned with a powerful and steady light. He did not speak. He made no gesture. He only stood there, a silent challenge to the entire courtroom. Raw knees spread across the room like a cold wind. Jedediah Finch's smirk disappeared instantly. He stared at Elias with growing fear. Harlan Voss leaned forward, his eyes wide, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps dread, passing across his face. Elena Voss watched Elias differently. In her eyes burned sudden fierce hope, as if she recognized that something important was about to happen. The silence in the courtroom became complete, heavier than any noise, stronger than any spoken word. It was the silence of 18 long years, finally standing on the edge of breaking. Every breath paused, every eye fixed on the silent man. Then Elias Drew, the man who had not spoken for nearly 2 decades, slowly opened his mouth. A low, rough sound came from his throat, like stone grinding against stone, tearing through the stillness of the courtroom. It was only a cough, the clearing of a throat unused for many years, but it sounded like thunder in the silent room. The courtroom froze. Judge Crane leaned forward in shock, his gavel forgotten in his hand. Jedediah Finch half rose from his chair, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as fear spread across his face. Harlan Voss stared in disbelief, his mouth slightly open, as if witnessing either a miracle or a nightmare. Elena Voss closed her eyes briefly, and a single tear slipped down her cheek, carrying a quiet prayer of hope. Elias cleared his throat again and drew in a deep, shaking breath. When his voice finally came, it was hoarse and rough, like a rusty hinge being forced open, but it was clear, steady, and filled with authority that silenced every other sound. "I waited," Elias said slowly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I waited until someone was finally ready to listen." A gasp moved through the courtroom. The words were simple, but they carried the heavy weight of 18 silent years. Judge Crane recovered his composure and struck his gavel loudly. "Order! Order in this court! Mr. Porge, Mr. Drew, if you have testimony, you must come to the witness stand." Elias walked forward slowly and carefully. Every eye followed him. Every breath remained held. He raised his hand and took the oath. His voice was still rough, but firm. "My name is Elias Drew. I have lived on the Voss property for 45 years. I have seen much, I have heard much, and I have remembered everything." Then he turned his eyes directly toward Jedediah Finch, who visibly flinched as the color drained from his face. "Jedediah Finch," Elias said calmly, "has been stealing money from Harlan Voss for the past 7 years. The courtroom exploded with gasps and shouting. Jedediah jumped to his feet. "Lies, he's a mute. He's mad. He can't even speak." Judge Crane struck the gavel again and again. "Silence, Mr. Finch. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt." "Mr. Drew, you may continue." Elias remained calm, his voice steady and measured, each word falling like a hammer of truth. "He began with small amounts," Elias explained. "He inflated the prices of feed and seed. On April 12, 1876, he charged for 20 sacks of cornmeal, but only 15 were delivered. The ledger will show the difference. On October 3, 1878, he sold 3 bales of cotton to Mr. Silas Thorne in Waycross, but reported only 2 to Mr. Voss. I saw the sale, I saw the payment." He spoke with the careful precision of an accountant, listing dates, numbers, suppliers, and the exact details of the stolen money. He explained Jedediah's methods, how he adjusted payroll, Delisle records, invented fake laborers, and pocketed the wages meant for workers who did not exist. He pointed out the specific ledger pages where the altered numbers could be found. The prosecutor, who had first looked doubtful, now wrote furiously, his eyes widening as he realized the truth. He kept another ledger. Elias continued quietly, still watching Jedediah, hidden under a loose floorboard in his cabin beneath the bed, wrapped in oilcloth. It contains the real accounts of his theft. Jedediah slumped into his chair, pale and shaken, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. The world of lies he had carefully built was collapsing piece by piece around him. Then Elias slowly turned his attention to the many secrets he had quietly witnessed inside the Voss household. "Clara R. Hayes," he said, his voice growing a little softer, "discovered these irregularities. She spoke with Mrs. Voss in a quiet and careful way about the missing supplies and the raised bills. I noticed their talks in the kitchen beside the pantry door. Mrs. Fires the pantry door. Mrs. Voss," he nodded toward Ella Lenana, who sat frozen in her chair, began to look deeper, to examine the accounts more closely. He described certain conversations he had seen through open windows or while working silently in the background. He recalled small pieces of arguments between Jedediah and Clara Errara, low and tense exchanges where Clara Errara's voice, though gentle, carried a hint of defiance, and Jedediah's tone was mixed with threat. He explained the body language, the expressions, the fear inside Clara Errara's eyes, and the desperation growing in Jedediah. It felt as if he had been present in every room, a quiet, unseen recorder, writing down every word and every movement. At last, Elias turned to the night of October 17th. The courtroom held its breath in deep silence. "On the night Clara Rara Hayes died," he began, his voice now steady and firm, "I was sitting on my porch. I saw the light burning in Mr. A. Voss's study. I heard raised voices. Jedediah Finch and Clara Hayes were arguing. I saw their shadows through the window. Jedediah looked restless and angry. Clara Hera was pleading with him. He described the sudden sharp sound, like something snapping or breaking, followed by a quiet cry that seemed forced down. Jedediah came out from the back door of the main house, moving very quickly. He went straight to the stable. He saddled Bess, Mr. Voss's mare, a gray horse with a white blaze and 3 white socks. He rode away toward town at a fast gallop. I marked the time. It was shortly after midnight. He then turned his eyes directly toward Samuel Davies, who sat in the gallery, his face now pale with fear. Samuel Davies, Elias said, was returning from Wayross that night. He saw Jedediah Finch riding Bess on the road that leads from the Voss property just outside the town. Their paths crossed. They looked at each other for a moment. Samuel Davies, unable to carry the heavy weight of Elias's stare and the clear truth behind it, let out a broken sob and hid his face inside his hands. Jedediah Finch, his face now a sick shade of green, began shaking badly. He tried to speak, but only a rough choking sound came from his throat. He grabbed his chest, his eyes rolled back, and he fell hard onto the floor, a shattered man. Judge Crane, his own calm shaken, called for order, but it was useless. The truth, released after 18 long years of silence, had torn apart the carefully built mask of Harrow County. "I have kept a record," Elias said, his voice rising clearly through the noise, "of everything I have seen, and everything I have seen, and everything I have heard for 18 years. With slow and careful movement, he reached into the inside pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a leather journal. It was old, its cover scratched and worn, its pages yellow with age, but it was whole. He passed it to the bailiff, who, with shaking hands, delivered it to the judge. Judge Crane opened the journal. The pages were not filled with writing, but with careful and detailed drawings. There were sketches of Jedediah studying ledgers, maps of the land with exact places marked, drawings of Bess the mare being ridden away in the darkness of night, and even a rough but clear sketch of Jedediah's hidden ledger under a loose floorboard. There were symbols, too, a complicated code Elias had slowly created over the years. Each mark stood for a date, a time, or an event. It was a silent visual testimony, a long record of a hidden life, patiently documented by a man who had chosen silence as his strongest weapon. The judge, his eyes wide with shock and wonder, began to read some entries aloud, turning the symbols and drawings into a cold and frightening story of theft, lies, and finally, murder. The courtroom listened in stunned quiet, the weight of Elias's 18 years of watching pressing down on everyone present. The truth, clear and undeniable, had finally found its voice, and it was a voice that had waited patiently for the moment when it would finally be heard. The result of Elias Drew's testimony was like a storm that swept through the calm comfort of Harrow County. Jedediah Finch, revived after his collapse, was taken into custody immediately. Faced with Elias's careful and undeniable proof and the crushing weight of his own guilt, he broke down. His confession came out in a broken flood of words, a tearful admission of stealing money and of the desperate act of murder meant to silence Clara Hayes. His confession confirmed every detail Elias had spoken. He admitted that he struck Clara during a burst of rage when she threatened to reveal his theft to Holland, and then he fled on Bess, hoping to build an alibi in a nearby town before returning to act. Shocked, the mare, he confessed, had been tied in a hidden grove outside the town and taken back before sunrise. Josiah Miller, the innocent man, was released from his cell that very evening. His reunion with his wife and children was filled with deep tears and relief, a small light of justice in a world that often lacked it. The black community of Harrow County, who had stood outside the courthouse in quiet prayer, burst into hymns and songs of praise, their voices celebrating the victory of truth over injustice. Josiah, his eyes still marked by suffering, walked to Elias and held his hand tightly. No words were spoken, but the gratitude inside Josiah's eyes said everything. Elias simply nodded, a quiet sign of shared struggle and duty fulfilled. The people of Harrow County, both black and white, were forced to face the truth. The trial had shown not only Jedediah's crimes, but also the failures, the prejudice, and the comfortable blindness that had allowed an innocent man to be blamed. Deputy Thorne, whose mistakes were now exposed, was quietly removed from his position, his reputation ruined. Samuel Davies, his conscience finally free, stepped forward to support Elias's story about seeing Jedediah on the road, his testimony now filled with courage. Elilanana Voss, her face carrying both sorrow and deep relief, went to see Elias the day after the trial. She found him at his cabin sitting on the porch, the worn journal resting on his knee. She sat beside him. The silence between them was now calm and understanding. "Elias," she began softly, "I do not know how to thank you. You saved an innocent man. You brought the truth into the light." She paused and looked into his eyes. "And you carried such a heavy burden for so many years. Why did you wait? Elias looked at her, his eyes holding deep wisdom. He reached for a small piece of paper and a pencil. Slowly he wrote a single sentence in careful script. They would not have believed me then. They would not have listened. He handed her the note. Eleanor read it, and tears filled her eyes. She understood. His silence had not been weakness. It had been patience and strategy, a deep understanding of the world around him, a world that would only listen when the evidence was so strong and so carefully recorded that it could no longer be denied. You are a remarkable man, Elias Drew, she whispered with emotion. Harrow Voss, however, found himself in a far more difficult place. The discovery of Jedediah's betrayal, along with the public shame, broke his world apart. He had to face his own blindness, his trust in a man who had cheated him for years, and his quick dismissal of Eleanor's and Clarara's warnings. The Voss property, already struggling, now faced an uncertain future. Harlan, once proud and traditional, was humbled. He came to Elias not with thanks, but with a desperate need to understand. He stood before Elias like a broken man. Elias, he said quietly, all these years you knew. Why didn't you tell me? Elias looked at him calmly. He picked up his pencil again and wrote, You did not ask T.